the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, Rebecca, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Jen, or Ed History 101, and I am so excited to talk to you today about your book, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, LAKOTA, and an American Inheritance. So welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about some incredibly heavy things, and I'm all happy when we start this conversation because it's such a great book.
I love that. I know it. I keep saying it's the opposite of a beach read, this book. But I also am glad that you feel that. I feel like, to me, there's this inherent hopefulness of the book. Do you feel that way? I don't know. Maybe I've just been a journalist too long, but.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm really thinking about what, we'll talk about it when we get towards the end, what you're talking with the rabbis, and especially Rabbi Rutenberg, about, how do we apologize? How do we move forward? And what does that look like? So yeah, I definitely finished it with a sense of hopefulness.
I'm glad. Good.
So if you want to start with, so I'll just provide just a kind of a quick overview. Actually, why don't you tell our listeners what the gist is? What's the log line for your book?
Yeah. Oh God, the log line. Well, I've been a journalist writing about the American West for more than 20 years. And throughout that, you don't write about the West without writing also about Native nations. And I was honored throughout my career to visit Native communities and report on what's happening there. And it took me somewhat of an embarrassingly long time to find myself in the history of Native America, because my family were homesteaders on the South Dakota Prairie. In fact, they were Jewish immigrant homesteaders who had escaped oppression in Russia and come to America because of the opportunities afforded to them here that they were not able to have there. And yet, how do a people who have fled oppression then become part of an oppressive system? Perhaps that's the through line of the book. Another through line is land. Who has it and who doesn't? And my book, in many ways, is tracking an entangled history of how United States federal policies and laws of the 20th century in the main, but really extending into the 19th century and up into this contemporary moment, were done with great intention to benefit certain groups of people, including my ancestors and myself, at great cost to the Lakota Nation and Native Americans more broadly.
Yeah. One of the things that you did with regards to, the issue of land, first, I really appreciated that, and I think it was your, the final section where you talk about how basically the entire book is a land acknowledgement and, acknowledging the land. But one detail you included that I really appreciated is you kept giving the reader a sense of the value, and I'm, using air quotes here, of the land, where you would say it was, $22 a parcel, or it was, you would give the reader context. And I'm wondering, how did you track down those values? Like, what were your research sources for finding those kind of hard numbers?
It was really not easy, actually. And it was important to me. I was sitting on such a trove of stories from people I'd interviewed who are living today, stories that had been passed down to me about my ancestors on the prairie, many historical texts. But I wanted to see if I could apply some hard data, kind of, because as journalists, we learn it's that kind of fact of it was this much money at this time. That's the scaffolding on which stories hang. And so because of that, I found them all over. So for native land values, some of those came from other historical books that had been written, but I also read literally tens of thousands of pages of reports that the Indian agents, who were the federal representatives on different reservations, they at one point were called Indian agents, then later they were called supervisors, but they would write letters every year to their bosses back in Washington, D.C. And they had a series of questions that they had to answer every year that were often the same. Tiny tangent. Many of these have to do with how easily the Native people are getting access to alcohol. So such an obsession with, can Native people get access to alcohol? And also, how many of them have converted to Christianity? Those are sort of the major threads. But in there, I found examples of how much land is being sold for. So from there, but I also, to figure out the land value for my own family, who they get their federal homestead, I don't know exactly. It's a little mushy. According to historians I spoke with, many people would go and sort of illegally sit on land that had been opened for homesteading and not get around to filing paperwork for a couple of years. But according to the National Archives records that I found, 1908, my family plants their first crop. And I then went and I pulled it's at the local level, the county level. I pulled every deed that members of my family had on land in South Dakota. And then I actually pulled in those same offices the mortgage, every single mortgage that is taken out on those deeds. And I created Excel spreadsheets, and I was able to track over time, okay, this is the value of their land, and then adjusted for inflation, that's how much this value is today. The other thing I did, and I know you're not asking this exactly, but to me, this is very important to understand what that land and that money from the land did for my family. I was sitting on an amazing trove of original documents. My family does not throw anything away. I myself have boxes in my own attic of school programs from 1983. I mean, I had tax returns that my great grandparents had kept from 1908. I had letters written in Yiddish. I had 30-day diaries that my great grandmother kept, as well as my grandmother's journals. It was very, somehow there's like a historian gene, a lay historian gene that you see in each branch of my family. There's someone who has this obsession. Anyway, when you compared the dates on the mortgages that were taken out to the information I'm learning from those original documents, you start to see a pattern. They would take out a mortgage and they would expand the land holdings. They would buy more land, or they would take out a mortgage and they would start a new business that's not reliant on weather. Or they would keep their land, but they would move. They would use that money to start over in a new place. And so you start, that is sort of, to me, just the incredible way that, and it's an American story, very American capitalist system, that we derive so much, that the land isn't just what you can make off of it in terms of crops, but how you can leverage land for other opportunity.
Yeah. One of the things that I really appreciated about the book is how you are so present as the author, but you invite the reader in to sit with you. So I'm wondering if you feel comfortable talking about how you, as an independent scholar and a reporter, negotiated, and a Jewish woman, negotiated the tension around immersing yourself in historical anti-Semitism and the experiences of your ancestors.
So I think when you're a reporter, you write what you have. So on the one hand, I was going to write the stories that I was given, and especially the places where my family history touches up against the history of our Lakota neighbors, because this is not meant to be, a definitive history of Jewish immigrants or a definitive history of Native people. It's this entangled history. It's showing that when you put these two histories right next to each other, you actually only then can see the depth of the injustice of federal policy, the way certain people were picked and certain people were not chosen to benefit from laws. But my rabbi early on said to me, you have to tell the truth, but you have to he didn't say you have to, but he advised me, tell the truth as deeply, as complicated, as messily as you can, and do it with great compassion. So the way I navigated so much really messy, complicated, nuanced terrain was to try and throw it all in, to think my readers are going to be smart enough that they can see the gray area, that I don't need to write in binary, these people were good, these people were bad, these people were victims, because I don't think that's true most of the time. And so in some ways, the messier it would be in the stories that I was telling, the more interesting and important and relevant it felt to me to write about it as much as I could. The way I navigated. So to me, this is a corrective. So much of the time, Jews, because we have experienced such anti-Semitism and are continuing to experience such anti-Semitism, there's this sense, I think, in our community that we get a pass. We often get a pass on thinking that we could have been victimizing others. And to me, it was important to me to say, well, actually, we could have. And if we as Jews, who have also been so oppressed, can start to look at the ways we have oppressed others, then why couldn't many other people in America who've had far more privilege than we have also step into this story and into this conversation? So there's that first step of saying, I wanted it to be a corrective. I actually was somewhat critical of my Jewish ancestors. And I think in the first pass, there was a lot more criticism, maybe subtly, but there. And in the second draft, after I had had a lot of readers and gotten feedback, I tried to bring more compassion to the Jewish side of the story, and to do that with a lot of more context and nuance. And so by showing more of the history of what my family experienced in Europe, what Jews throughout hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe had experienced in terms of oppression before they get to America, by showing the anti-Semitism that my family was still negotiating when they arrived, to me, that all helps make sense of their attitudes, why it was actually safe and a way of surviving for them to adapt certain racist attitudes about Indians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as you're kind of describing, one of the things I'm kind of struck by is usually when we do Ask Historians podcast, it's here, we're going to talk about this person, we're going to talk about this event, and we can pretty clearly delineate the history. We're going to follow this history. But the thing that makes your book so powerful and such a great addition to this sort of literature is it's so complicated that every time you want to be like, okay, so here's black and white, here's what it is. Nope. dial it back. And I really did appreciate that as a reader. But I especially appreciated when you were able to put the two stories side by side. And in one place you do that is where you highlight the relationships, or the kind of the I don't even know what adjective to use there, between Yiddish and the Lakota language. So I'm wondering if you could say more about, is that work that scholars have noticed before? Is that something that you noticed? How did that discovery come about?
So for those who don't know, Yiddish is a language that is really dying out, but it was around for many, many, many centuries. It's a blend of Hebrew, German, Slavic languages, and it was spoken by Jews, and for definitely my Ashkenazi ancestors, Eastern European Jews, both where they lived in what was then Russia, what is today Belarus, and when they come to America. And I don't think anyone has written a scholarly work comparing the Lakota language and the Yiddish, although I would love to read it if someone does. But what I learned was that, and I'm not an academic, but I was told by several people I spoke with that, there's debate around whether culture leads to language or language creates culture. People go back and forth about that. But you start to see, when you pay attention to these languages, how much the cultural attitudes about land, about time, are really even buried in the language itself, which I found fascinating. So, for example, in Lakota, there is no tense for the past that is different from the present. There is what has happened before and is happening in this moment as I say it, and then the future, which to me is so beautiful when you think about what I have come to believe, although I didn't maybe before working on this book, that I used to think the past is something we're always walking away from. It's behind us. Now I think about the past as being threaded to this contemporary moment like thread through a seam. It's right here. And the language in Lakota language does that. Very traditional Hebrew does the same thing. Yiddish separately, there's a wonderful book uh, called Born to Kvetch by Michael Wex that's all about how actually the Jews into the diaspora, Jews in the diaspora that are so vulnerable to being kicked out again, that they're always anticipating exile. Within Yiddish language, there are so many idioms that are complaints, that are funny, but they're reminding people just in the idiom, don't get too comfortable here. Don't get too comfortable. The worst is coming. Be on alert. And that's so fascinating to me. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And how you talk about is it Lakota? Is that the noun for their language? Like, do
Lakota language,
Lakota
yeah.
people speak Lakota? Okay. So,
Yeah.
but how verb heavy it is, and the storytelling, and
Exactly. Yes, that like there wasn't a written tradition and it was oral tradition, and that my Lakota sources and friends and elders have explained it to me that it's first of all, it's a far more efficient language than English. You can say something within like one sentence that takes a paragraph in English, because there are so much verbs, and that also not only are there so much action, there's also incredible lots of words that show relationship between people and rivers or land, that show relationship and show responsibility, that there's a lot of inherited sense of how you as a person have a responsibility to the people and entities you're engaging with, just even in the language. Which is why when the language is lost, elders explained to me, so much culture is lost, because a story that you would tell kind of leaps to its feet, because it's so important the way you're telling the story and the language you're using, not just the language but the sound of your voice, things like that.
yeah, goodness. Well, what made you decide that this was the right time for this book? I got the sense you've worked on it for a couple years. You started pre 2020. What made you decide this was the
2019,
right time? Yeah.
yeah, 2019 was the beginning. I mean, is there ever a right time to write a very complicated book? I don't know. I had little kids. It was just like, oh yeah, this will be easy. No, I think it was for me more not thinking this is the right time, but it was where I was the most curious personally. I had been hired by an investigative nonprofit journalism shop called Investigate West in 2017 to write a series of stories about Native nations and Native people and what their lives were like. And that series actually ran in The Nation and Indian Country Today. If people are interested in checking it out, links to those stories are on my website. And it was after spending a few years writing that series, I'm so grateful I had that time. It was through the process of writing that series that I really had that slow dawning realization, oh wait, I'm culpable here on some level. The legacy of federal policy in Indian country, it's ongoing today, those harms, and yet I've benefited from some of those same laws. And I was having lunch with some journalism friends, some journalists, and who are smarter than me, and I was trying to think about how could I write a book. And my friend David Woolman, who's a wonderful writer, his book Aloha Rodeo is wonderful. It's about Hawaiian cowboys. Anyway, yeah, right. Never thought of that. He said to me, "What do you owe the Sioux? That's your book." And it
Oh.
became so much more complicated than that. But it was the beginning of seeing of a very. I loved that question because it put me right in the middle of the history personally.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for listeners to know I am in the book, but I tried to I start out in a very personal way in the prologue and I come back in the epilogue, but really only with voice am I on the page throughout. I sort of tried to step back from the page a bit because no one needs to hear about my hand wringing and, in that way. But but I am certainly there throughout.
Yeah, I did appreciate that you stepped in to share that you did not get slapped. Your mother did not slap you upon a particular stage in your adolescent development. I was
Right?
glad to hear that that did not happen.
Me too. Yeah.
Did you answer that question? What do you owe the Sioux? What did you decide?
So first of all, I just want to say that most Lakota people prefer the term Lakota. Sioux is a misnomer that was created by French traders and the Chippewa, the Lakota's enemies, which comes from a word which actually means snakes. So just to put that out there, I don't use that word, even though Dave, it's in the world, but I don't know that I fully answered it or that there is a complete and full answer. We have 570 tribes that are federally recognized in this country. So first of all, there's going to be a lot of answers.
Yeah.
For me, with the Lakota, I did really grapple with this. I did 3 or 4 years of study with my own rabbi, Benjamin Barnett, studying Jewish texts for looking for answers there about how do we repair from a harm, even when we didn't directly commit, but one we've benefited from. I did that because an indigenous judge, Judge Abby Abenanti, who's Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation, she told me, if you're going to look at these entangled histories, you have to study your own culture. What does your culture say about how to respond to a harm? And I don't include every single teaching from the Torah and the Talmud that I learned, but the ones that were the most powerful, I do share in the book. And if after a lot of that study, after a lot of conversations with Lakota elders, I did come up with a reparation that my own family can do. I think more powerfully to share here for individuals who are thinking about, well, what can I do? It's to remember a few things. First of all, we are living in a vacuum of federal leadership on this issue. Unlike Canada, Australia, New Zealand, countries that have a very similar relationship of dispossessing Native nations, of the indigenous peoples and of their land, those countries have done imperfect but processes to grapple with that past and try and step towards right relationship with the indigenous peoples of their nations. And we have hardly even had a real apology. So I think it's important for people as they start to consider this to know, we don't have federal leadership on this, and most of us aren't even taught this history in school. So for many people, this is new. And that's, of course, intentional, that many states have decided to not include certain teaching of Native history in their curriculum, their public school curriculum. I mean, when kids find out about what happened, then of course they want to say, well, how do we make it better? That's a very natural question to ask. And I think it can feel a little threatening to politicians. I think I did an event in San Francisco in October with Judge Abby Abenanti. If anyone is interested, you can find it on YouTube. She says, someone in the audience said, what can we do? I live here in San Francisco. What can we do? And she said, what you need to do is have relationships with the Native people of where you live. She said, it's conversations like this one. And she pointed to me that we've been having for so many, I think it's been 6 or 7 years that we've known each other. She said, this is healing. She knows what I want and need, and I know what she wants and needs, and we can support one another. And she said, I know that sounds vague, but it is what is needed. And so I encourage people who are wanting to step into this conversation to first, I have resources in the back of the book that can help people start to do their own research about their own family's history and their own land and where their land came from. What treaty was signed that allowed for the city on which you live? What treaty was probably broken so that you can have a house there? And what are the Native nations that used to live or hunt there and are now probably still living somewhere nearby? And how can you get involved in supporting what's important to them. Following the lead of Native efforts is really key. We as white people or non-natives don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to create new organizations. We just should, in my opinion and the opinion of scholars who've studied this, just support those efforts. And even though there's no federal effort, there's been some research and looking at these kinds of reconciliation efforts that are happening at the local level. And they found that these local efforts are very meaningful, even though they're not part of a big federal system, and that maybe they're even more, they can be more flexible, they can be more unique and specific. So there's hope in that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm reminded that, we're often in the activism circles. There's I can't have blanking on who said it, but it was something along the lines of, if you're a white activist who wants to get more involved and you think you have an original idea, you don't. Look to the community. Someone's had the idea before. Support them.
Exactly.
And I did appreciate that at the end you had the resources and you had some recommendations. And I think really that reminder that we need to go local. We need to look around us, and, knowing our own histories is really quite powerful. Do you see yourself continuing this particular project, or are you starting a new project?
I have a new book idea. It has to do with land, but it doesn't have anything to do with, at this point, it doesn't have anything to do with Jews or Native people. I feel like I, of course, want to keep writing about the American West. That's really what I know and what I have cared deeply about for 23 years. And I'm from here and have lived here almost my entire life. It's the region that I think is so often overlooked and ignored by people on the East Coast, and it's because there's so many more people on the East Coast. So to me that matters. But I care deeply about this book, and I'm laughing a little because I think the journalist in me is like, okay, did that, moving on. And I'm delighted but so surprised that people still want to keep talking. I mean, the book came out in October. That's 3 months ago. Like, really? People still want to talk to me and talk about the book. And of course, and I have many more events that I'm doing throughout the country and then in the coming year. And I'm thrilled to continue this conversation. I think this book is the most important work of my career so far, and maybe will ever be. But yes, I have a new book idea. I want to write another entangled history again. I really have loved this idea of when you put two things that seem different next to each other and you learn something new about them both. I'd like to do that again.
That phrase, entangled history, is such a great phrase. Makes it complicated for a history podcast to try to talk about it.
You have to cross-reference.
Yeah, you have to but wait, there's this, and then there's this, and then there's that.
I think for booksellers too, they're like, is it Native studies? Is it Jewish history? Yeah. Is it U.S. history? It's both. It's all of them.
It's very clear while reading that you definitely did your research and that you talked to, the conversations you had, and, you reached to your family history. And I'm curious, because you do wear a journalism hat more than you wear a historian's hat. Did you access a fact checker? Did you have a historian kind of read over chapters? What was that process like?
Absolutely. So the whole book was fact checked. I both hired fact checkers. I also did some of the fact checking myself. I hired a native, a person who is part Native himself and as a PhD to do some of the fact checking, since he had a very specific subject area interest and expertise. I had gotten the Whiting nonfiction grant for this project it's a grant for work in progress. And I used some of that money to do a couple extra layers of sensitivity reads. So before my editor even got the book, I sent the book to 2 trusted LAKOTA sources and scholars who read the book, making sure I had represented everything correctly. And then I also shared it with 2 Jewish historians and scholars who were sources of mine who did the same thing for me. And then Penguin Books, who's my publisher, they also hired an Indigenous editor to do a read, and they hired a a Jewish American studies scholar to do a read as well, to make sure, again, that we were checking everything. There are about 75 pages of endnotes in the book, which I hated writing. I hated it. But I'm really grateful they exist and that they can, my editor really felt like this is kind of a newish kind of book, and she felt like because of that I really want to have this endnotes. It shows such the depth of your reporting, and also can be so hopefully very valuable to others.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit kind of in the weeds, but I'm a developmental editor, a freelance editor, and I was struck by this new approach to footnoting, where you don't really realize there's footnotes unless you notice the table of contents, then you notice at the end of the book. And I'm also really impressed to hear that Penguin hired. I know publishers had been getting in hot water a few times because many of the publishers weren't hiring fact checkers. So I'm so glad to read.
They did not hire the fact checkers. I had to pay for
The
that
editors,
myself.
I'm sorry, that they did a sensitivity read, for lack of a better word.
Oh,
And
they
you
did.
hiring them. Nice. And you hiring all those fact checkers, that's definitely a commitment to telling the truth, as the
I
chart.
did not enjoy spending that money, but I'm really grateful. I'm so grateful to them for helping me, because yeah, there's so many details, and of course, how could I? It was really important. I'm grateful
Yeah.
I did that. Yeah.
And not that historians don't do that, but I think that's, I think sometimes people hesitate to pick up a book about history written by a journalist because they fear that, because they're not a historian. But I do think, based on what you described and other journalists who's written about history that I've read, that attention to detail, in that, hiring all the extra resources and really getting all those extra eyes, I think is such a great boon to the book, such as yours. So I think that
you can't do it yourself. My friend Lee Vanderbilt, who's a wonderful journalist, she just said at one point, you can't write a book like this on your own. You need other eyes. And I think that's so true. I had so many layers of readers, family, LAKOTA family members, my family members, friends who are brilliant journalists, a friend who's a poet and a Jewish scholar. Their eyes on this book helped so much. And I had an incredible editor I had two different incredible editors actually at Viking, and they helped immensely as well. But yeah, I think it was important to me.
Nice, mm-hmm. Nice. Did anything surprise you while you were working on the book? Anything?
Oh my God. So many things. So many things surprised me, and I went down so many rabbit holes where I would be like 2 weeks later and I was still researching something that I knew would be literally a paragraph in the book. But that was the joy of it. Also, was getting to have the money and the time to really follow my curiosity. And so there were so many things that surprised me, and I know we don't have time to get to all of them. A couple very quick ones. One that I think is really shocking is that I knew that the United States gave free land to homesteaders like my family. What I didn't know until working on this project is that the United States also gave a lot of free land to churches in exchange for those churches doing the work of quote unquote civilizing Native people and also converting them. And so to this day, I actually was able to find an archivist at Marquette University shared with me a realty report from the 90s from the Catholic Church of all the land they had in Indian country. I connected with Robert Lee, who has this incredible database, and he helped me do some research, which found there are 30,000 acres of land in America today that are owned by churches that are native lands, like they're on reservations. So this is, again, you see, it's ongoing. This is not in the past. This is still today. Another thing that just blew my mind, I was a kid who was obsessed with the Holocaust. I did like embarrassing readings on the mantle from Anne Frank to my family and my stuffed animals of like, I really do believe people are still quite good at heart. And yet I didn't know until I worked on this project that Hitler was inspired by how America treated Native people. And he applied many of the tools that the United States uses to control and victimize both Black Americans and Native people, both in legal ways and just in physical ways, he applies that to Jewish citizens in Europe. So, and there's a whole thread throughout my book, and there's an incredible book by James Whitman called Hitler's American Model. He's a legal professor out of Yale. That's a whole book about this. But again, until I started, it wasn't until a Lakota elder told me that. I didn't know it until then. So.
Yeah, having those dots get connected and seeing how it's all, it feels like one of those things like you should know, and then you see me like, well, obviously, you know. Oh, goodness gracious. Is there anything else you'd like listeners to know about the book or about the journey of your book?
Great question. I always ask that question as a journalist. What am I not asking you? I mean, I know a lot of people in your listening are a lot of people interested in writing, like how you write a thing?
I'm interested.
I mean, I could talk a little about that. I think one thing I think I've learned, and I've learned that this is true for many other writers, is that the second half of a book is so much easier to write than the first half. The first half sucks. Can I use the word sucks on?
Sure.
It's so hard. There's chapter 4. Oh my God, chapter 4. I rewrote it so many times. It was so hard. And I remember chapter 6 at one point showing to my husband, who read it and was like, yeah, there's a lot of Cynicans in here. Like, I'd already written that chapter 4 or 5 times, and the Cynicans is my family story. So figuring out the balance of how much of my own family story to put in or not put in, what's relevant to anyone who's not in my family, was actually a really difficult thing to do. And so I had a boss. I used to be an editor at High Country News, and my old boss, Betsy Martson, she used to say, rewriting is writing. And I just think that's so true. It's the rewriting that makes something shine. I also, before I wrote this book, I wrote a novel 5 years ago when my kids were babies and I couldn't figure out how to be on an assignment. And that's another book about the American West. It's called Kick Down. But I think, having written a novel, I don't know if I'll ever write another novel, but I wrote that book 4 times fully. And I also have been writing poetry, somewhat embarrassingly, but I've been starting to get some poetry published. And I think it's actually the writing in other ways besides writing journalism, the kind of cross training for my brain. My closest people think that the writing in this book reflects that poetry writing and that novel writing, that there's a way of looking at the world in a different way than as a journalist that comes onto the page. And I trust them. I think that's probably true.
I agree with them. There are some incredibly lyrical sections. Your descriptions of, the West and the land, and there's several parts where you talk about grass and the different kinds of grass. And yeah, so I would definitely agree with your family that it definitely came through. And kind of one last thing to sing your praises. Chapter 4, I don't know on what rewrite this came up, but one of the things we sometimes have a hard time helping people understand is that when it came to the Indian industrial schools, yes, children were absolutely kidnapped. Yes, people came and took children to the schools, but families also sent their kids. And I think it's so hard to get our head around why parents would do that. Why would they willingly send their children to this school? And, that whole thing about the apocalypse, that, you've lived through the end of the world. And if this is what it takes to get your child through the end of the world, this is what you're going to do. And I thought your chapter 4, you did a fantastic job helping the reader understand that it's not this simple case. It's also these complexities that people were dealing with and how you negotiate all of that. So chapter 4 turned out great.
Thank you. I think it was the LAKOTA, so one of those LAKOTA sources, who said you need to read Paul Freire to understand the pedagogy of the oppressed. And that, I came to that book slightly later after a couple years already of working on the book, but the ideas in there did help contextualize and nuance some of those complexities for both the Jewish and Lakota story of how you can be oppressed and adopt the tools of your oppressor as a survival tactic.
Yeah. as a survival tactic. And I think to kind of transition from that idea of survival to the end of your book, I do absolutely think it's a hopeful book, that you leave the reader with a solid sense that change is possible, and whether it is reconciliation, that there is something that can be done, and it's up to all of us. We can do it. So again, Rebecca, thank you so much. This has been great. I really strongly recommend. We'll of course have a link to your website where people can get the book. And if listeners really want to listen to or read a complex, multi-layered, multifaceted history, I think your book is a fantastic entry into that genre. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just been really a delight.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.